JKB back with another episode. Today on the show, I'm reviewing the Xbox One X. Thank you so much to Microsoft for sending over this. They also included 20 games, and I have most of them. So what I'm going to do for you guys is a giveaway for games like Madden and FIFA 18. I'll be giving those away on Twitter, on my Facebook, and Instagram over the next few days. So make sure you go and find me on those. I'll link in the underbar to everything. I'll be giving those away in the next couple of days. Once again, I wasn't paid by Microsoft to do this review as I puke in my mouth. They just gave me the system and said, enjoy. There was no notes. There was no like, blah, blah, blah. Make sure you say this. I can say anything about this. I'll say it's as heavy as a fucking house. That's one thing I'll say. Let's start out with some of the important questions that a lot of people ask me about the system. There's two aspects to this system, and I think a lot of people assume that this is just a 4K system. I'm not going to get it until I get 4K. Why would I get it if I only have 1080p? Well, in layman's terms, because I don't want to get too tight, like 60 frames anti-aliasing was turned on and it stuttered. Like, I'm not getting into the technical aspects of the system in terms of like what it literally is doing behind the scenes. That's for like Digital Foundry to figure out. Go watch that video. What I'm going to do here is talk to you like a friend who got the system ahead of you and say, okay, you only have 1080p, should you pick it up? Okay, you have a 4K television, should you pick it up? The first part of this review is going to focus on the 1080p games because a lot of people out there don't have 4K televisions. And to simply put, the system definitely, 110%, does make 1080p games look better. How does it achieve this? Well, back in the day when Doom came out for the Xbox One S, it had dynamic scaling in terms of its resolution. This meant that to keep a steady frame rate, it had to dump the resolution down to meet this whatever frames per second, 60 frames per second. So if it was dropping below that, 60 frames per second, because there was a lot of stuff happening on the screen, it would automatically bring the resolution down and up the frames per second. So you would notice things would look kind of out of focus or muddy. You know, a lot of people use that term, like things look muddy, like washed out mud. Or, you know, it might be, you might even notice the resolution drop in a couple of sections in that game, and that was a huge annoyance. So what this system does, because obviously it's capable of doing 1080p, but also 4K, when you're doing something in 4K, you need to be literally a supercomputer. You need to be a top-of-the-line PC, which this essentially is. What this is going to do for 1080p is take the dynamic scaling of resolution and completely get rid of that. It's going to run all of the 1080p games that you've been playing on your Xbox One S or the original Xbox and basically put it at its max resolution throughout the whole game without a single hiccup. So that's the first thing it's going to do. The second thing it's going to do is make the game look crisper based on the fact that if you have the Xbox One X hooked up to the internet, which 100% of you probably do, you will be still downloading patches that are Xbox One X enhancements for the games. Now, these enhancements are sent out by the developers, but there's a huge difference here. Some games will just look better based on the enhancements that the studio, or the dev I should say, has put forth. So to give you an example, Skyrim, for instance, is going to have a 4K enhancement ability, which this does a lot. What this is going to do is essentially take the textures and put them to the absolute max on 4K. But when you think in terms of those enhancements on 4K, that also trickles down to the 1080p aspect, because the textures that are usually in Skyrim at 1080p, if it's enhanced, will still look better in 1080p because it's using the enhanced textures on all of the models in the game. So not only is it going to run as smooth as hell, it's also going to look incredible based on the fact that it has an enhancement. But in saying that, the games don't even need the Xbox One X enhancements on top of them to look good, because the system also renders out everything in a different way. Now, to get into the technical terms of this, the frame rate used to have, a target frame rate. So let's say Doom, 60 frames per second, probably drop down the resolution to hit the 60 frames like I said on the original Xbox One. On this though, it will never drop frame rate, ever, period. It'll run at a solid 60 frames at the top resolution, and you'll never, ever, ever have to deal with dynamic scaling in terms of resolution ever again. The other thing it's going to do for 1080p players out there is load the games much faster. So when I did a test to see the difference, it literally is about 40 to sometimes 35% faster in terms of its loading. So Assassin's Creed Origins in 1080p did run at about 40% quicker than when I ran it on my Xbox One S in 1080p. Now, that's saying a lot about the 1080p aspect. Do you go out there and purchase this as an upgrade? This is going to really come down to some real questions you're going to have to ask yourself if you're not going to go into the 4K realm yet. Do you rush out there and get this? Well, loading times for me are a big deal. And the fact that it makes every game just basically look better and run at its best performance out of the box in 1080p is also a big deal. It's like you're going to be upgrading your PC essentially, but you're upgrading your Xbox to its top of the line. Then it's going to be available in the future when you get a nice 4K TV to simply pop it on here, and now you're running the games in 4K resolution, as well as all of the Xbox One enhancements in higher textures. The frame rate's always going to be at its max. The resolution is always going to be at its max in 4K, which I'm going to get to in a second. But in closing the 1080p aspect of this system, because I've been rambling, I would say if you are a hardcore Xbox person, you are just obsessed with Xbox, you love the exclusives, you love, all third party on here, I will say this much. There's no other system, and I'm saying it right now, PlayStation 4 Pro, even in 1080p, let's say the new Shadow of Mordor game, Digital Foundry did this too, so I'm not just making this up out of the blue, but that game in 4K, in the future, does look way better than the PlayStation 4 Pro version. But even in 1080p, it still is going to look better than any PlayStation 4, maybe not the Pro, but it's still going to look better than the PlayStation 4 version. It's going to run better, it's going to do everything better. So that's the difference here. It's like taking the original Xbox and just scaling it up in terms of power. That's what you're going to get. Faster loading times, the best frame rate, and the highest resolution. So I'm going to close out the 1080p by saying, if you're a fucking hardcore Xbox fan, you go out there and get this thing, because if you're thinking about getting a PlayStation 4 for the 4K and all the boost and all that stuff that the PlayStation does, I'm not downplaying that, but one aspect of the system is this does have a 4K Blu-ray player, so the people out there, well, it's $100 more, you are kind of paying for that 4K Blu-ray player as well. And let me tell you, at the end of this, when I get into the 4K, when you have a Samsung QLED TV hooked up to this thing in 4K, and you pop in like Planet Earth 2 in 4K, it's like you're looking into a fucking window into Mount Everest. You can like reach your hand in the screen and touch a buffalo's ass. It's dead serious. Let's get into the 4K aspects of the system. The first game I experienced in 4K was Gears of War 4. I experienced at the event when I picked up the system, and I noticed right off the bat the textures were completely and utterly brilliant. They looked amazing. Now, in terms of 4K versus 1080p, is there a major difference? Let's say I have a Samsung QLED TV that was super expensive, and this is a big jump. I mean, when you go from a 1080p to a 4K, and I mean a 4K TV that you should be getting for things like this, it's the price difference is major. Let's just say that. I'll be paying it off until I'm fucking 90. The point here is, though, when you take 1080p and put 4K next to it, there's, obviously a jump in the resolution. That's one aspect that makes the game look better. But the other aspect that makes the game look better is with the Xbox One enhanced version of the game, which you'll be downloading once you get the patches that are going to be coming out for these games, it's going to bump the resolution to 4K, which is a big deal for a lot of people out there. But not only that, the system can also handle the games at 60 frames per second in 4K with amazing looking textures, with, you know, rendering capabilities that the original Xbox One can just not do. So when you get into the 4K aspect of the system, it's tough. It's tough. Don't kill me here, but it's tough sometimes to see the difference in the games, because it's going to come down to something here known as the Xbox One Enhanced Download, or whatever they want to call it. So when you download the game on the Xbox One S, it comes as its standard version. When you download a game on here, it's called the enhanced version. This means the dev had a developer kit that allowed them to implement certain aspects that it couldn't do on the Xbox One S. This means resolution or frame rate or the textures. It's going to really come down to the devs to decide what they want to do. Now, one amazing aspect of this is that I saw the new Lord of the Rings game, Shadow of Mordor, running on the Xbox One X, and then I saw it on the PlayStation 4 Pro, because the example they've used there is the pinnacle of examples of what this system can do versus a PlayStation 4 Pro. If you don't believe me in this review, just simply go to the Digital Foundry review of those two games running next to each other. The difference is kind of ridiculous. The Xbox One X blows the hell out of the PlayStation 4 Pro in terms of the Shadow of Mordor, in terms of how it's rendering it and all of the performance and loading times. It's quite stunning. Now that comes down to the dev and what they've decided to do with the dev kits that they've been sent for the Xbox One X. I talked to the team over at Microsoft about this and said, how is it going to work? Well, each company is going to have the ability to really utilize those tools, and they don't necessarily have to go above a PlayStation 4 Pro in terms of performance and quality, but it's open to them. First party, though, is a different story. Forza 7 in 4K is like looking into the future of gaming. I mean, it is really unbelievable to look at. You guys know that I'm a huge fan of racing games, and HDR is a term that's thrown around all the time. What this means is essentially you're going to get a more dynamic render on the screen. This also plays into which television you're using. HDR in its own right is something that at the beginning I had no idea what it meant. I thought it's just doing something with the color, but what it really is doing is kind of playing with the contrast and what you can see in terms of the visuals on screen. So blacks are more black. I know that sounds ridiculous, but on a lot of televisions, producing a black image is very hard. This, however, on my Samsung QLED TV 55-inch, which was about $3,000 Canadian, so you do the math to the people that live in the States, when you put HDR on versus it off on this system, there is a huge difference in terms of what I can tell. Some people out there just walking by will not notice these things. What this means is when you have like a vision on screen of an ocean and you have the clouds and you have the deep blues, HDR on is going to let you see the clouds in crisp detail. It's going to let you see aspects of the clouds that are usually washed out. The older system would mud it over and you wouldn't really get to see that. But in 4K HDR, everything on Ultra, I mean, guys, it is, to me, is like upgrading your PC. You're upgrading your Xbox One X to the ultimate, but you have to consider the fact that you need a television that's going to accompany that. I've got my phone. Let's go over a few questions from the audience. Moose Ridge from Instagram asks, please comment on the fan and the system sound versus the previous models, and if you notice any differences with the UI and menu navigation. Well, they updated the UI, and I think it's very much the last time they need to do it. It's kind of set up into a few different sections, and it's quite simple to use. I'm not going to get into detail of that because if you have an Xbox One, Right now, you probably already have the new menu system built into it with the update that just came out. So it's not ridiculous, but it makes things a lot easier in terms of navigating the UI on the system. So to answer that, yeah, it's better than it's ever been in the past, but they seem to upgrade it every second. Now, in terms of how loud systems are, let's start with the PlayStation 4, just the base model that came out. When that thing kicks into overdrive, it sounds like my house is going to fucking take off. It is so loud and ridiculously annoying that literally to the point now that I'm going to say this in this review, because I own the Xbox One X and a 4K TV, I will never, ever, ever again, ever play another third-party game on my PlayStation 4. There's no need for it whatsoever. I've got this system that's going to make it look better, and not only that, I can actually hear the game above the goddamn fan. So that's one thing on the PlayStation side that I always was annoyed by. Now, I've never played with the PlayStation 4 Pro. I don't know the sound on that. However, Xbox One S, I totally have spent hundreds of hours with that system. Does that thing get loud? I wouldn't say that it's loud. I would say that it runs at a decent, level of audio coming out the side of it. It's not like it's going to take my fucking house into outer space. It's not taking off my desk either. It's a normal fan that you would hear in any computer. Now, in terms of the Xbox One X, it is a touch louder than that when it kicks into high gear. It's also going to come down to where the system's placed. If you put it into a cabinet with a back on it, the fan might be amplified coming out the back of that, and you might have to deal with a louder sound. When the back, I notice, is not kind of like deflecting the sound of the fan back into the living room, it isn't as loud as the PlayStation 4. It still is quite loud. You will definitely hear it, but once you have your television up at like 10 or anything above that in terms of volume level, you're not going to hear the Xbox. You might hear it once in a while if you really pay attention to something, but you're not going to hear it as much as like a PlayStation 4. That was just ridiculous. Let's get to the pros and cons. Now, the first one I want to bring up is not really a pro or a con. It's more of, I want to talk about the price of this system. $100 more than the PlayStation 4 Pro. You're getting something that can do, and it's been proven through Shadow of Mordor, way better rendering, way better frame rates, way better textures, everything. I mean, it does it better than the PlayStation 4 Pro, but it's $100 more. What you're doing is essentially paying $100 to get that 4K Blu-ray player. And if you've already went that far in, you probably have a television that does 4K. So at that point in time, I really do feel like if you're all in for this thing, yeah, go all in it. I mean, you're going to get that 4K player that really is unbelievable when you have the true 4K television in front of it. But you're also going to get the boost in performance for the whole rest of this generation. Let's talk about a true con, because a lot of people will want to know about this. This is the 1 terabyte model. This means that I fit about 20 games on the hard drive before it filled up. And let me also say this, the 4K enhanced versions of the games, some of them are like 90 gigabytes. It is ridiculous. So you'll have to definitely get an external hard drive if you want to really have all of your digital games ready. Now, the good news here is if you have a digital game, you can obviously put it onto an external hard drive and bring that over to your friend's house and just plug it in. And that's a cool aspect. Sign into your account and use it off the hard drive. You don't have to worry about lugging the system around. That's one cool aspect that I do like about Microsoft and its Xbox brand. 1 terabyte is a little low. So I got to be honest, that is the only negative I came across when I got into the system, and it kind of is a big one to certain people out there. But I mean, if you have the money to spend on all this stuff, a hard drive on top of it might not be a big deal. You probably have one lying around. Yeah, it is kind of a negative. The people that are on the fence that might not know what to go with, you've got an Xbox One S, you've got a PlayStation 4 Pro, Do you go with an Xbox One X at that point when you have the Pro version of a PlayStation? I mean, if you have the money, I'm going to say yes, because it does dramatically make games look better than the PlayStation 4 version and the PlayStation 4 Pro version in terms of, Shadow of Mordor. That game looks unbelievable on this system. So do you go out there and buy it? All of these questions, do I buy it? Do I upgrade? The 1080p aspect, third party, is such a big deal to me. I will never play a third-party game on my PlayStation 4 ever again. I will be loading it on here, and I'll be upgrading to the 4K, but I'll have to deal with the 4K upgrades. This review was difficult to do because we're talking about a system that is just sort of a stepping stone into the next generation, and it is quite expensive to just use this stepping stone. But the next system's guaranteed will be 4K, the next generation. So if you're jumping ahead and you just want to get faster loading times, almost 40% for Assassin's Creed Origins. Once you upgrade to the enhanced versions of these games at 4K, you do notice a difference. It is sharper, it runs better, the frame rate's spectacular, and you are going to notice you essentially have purchased a super high-end PC that can handle these things. So I want to thank you once again for watching. This is a ridiculous review. It's long. If you have any other questions, comment below and I'll do my best to answer them. I highly recommend this for the people who can afford it. If you can't afford it yet, you can wait, but you might want to upgrade even if you have 1080p, because there are a lot of benefits. 40% faster loading times. The resolution will be locked at 1080p, obviously on a 1080p TV, but you're going to get the advantage of higher performance in the frames per second and everything else that this thing can do. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode of JKB.